Getting a business off the ground requires data-driven strategy and a truly exceptional product. But entrepreneurs know there is a lot more to building a business than analytics and sleek design.
We want to know what makes founders tick, how they pivot to tackle the hard stuff, what keeps them up all night and going each day. I'm Jenny Rudin.
And I'm Katie Demo, and we're the co-founders of Brass Clothing and your hosts for Making It Happen, a show where we have raw, honest conversations with other founders like ourselves.
Join us for fly-on-the-wall access to intimate discussions about what it's really like to start, run, and grow a business. This is Making It Happen.
Everyone, and welcome to the premiere of Making It Happen. We would love to thank you for joining us for our first season. We have an incredible cast of all female founders we cannot wait to introduce you to.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome our very first guest to the show, Erica Liu Williams, founder of granola brand Great Nola.
Great Nola is a very cool granola company. It has graced the shelves of tons of Silicon Valley tech companies like Slack and Facebook and Dropbox, just to name a few. Not to mention, they have celebrity fans like Halle Berry.
But the path to success wasn't easy. It meant overcoming certain mental, emotional, and personal challenges, which Erica, a former Olympic trial athlete, knows a thing or two about. Leaving a stable career in Silicon Valley to start your own business casts a whole new light on the concept and importance of grit. And diving into that conversation is exactly what we're about to do with Erica right now. So welcome, Erica. Hi, Erica. How's it going?
Good. I'm so excited to be here. Honored to be on the premiere debut episode today.
Erica, you had a pretty unique path, semi-professional athlete turned founder. We'd love to hear about your personal journey before launching your business in 2013.
Yeah.
So tell us how the stage was set.
Sure. So I would say from a pretty young age, 8th grade, my path was pretty linear. I was on an accelerated track for swimming. I actually qualified for Olympic trials when I was 13. And so by the time I was like in 9th or 10th grade, I already knew any college, as long as I kept up my grades, was within reach and I was going to definitely swim in college. So I graduated high school in 2004 and I ended up signing with Stanford. And, I think that I thought, okay, I'm going to continue swimming for these 4 years and going to try to pursue making the Olympic team, which by the way, didn't happen. And I think that's where things started to take a turn, which was in college, where, I actually found myself incredibly unfulfilled and burnt out from my swimming career. And I did what I thought I would never do, which was I actually ended up quitting swimming early. So I ended up quitting after my sophomore year. And that was basically a decision based on my core values of, hey, this is not making me happy. It's not like swimming is going to be a long-term career. So, I just want to make sure that I'm like actually enjoying my life, right? So I didn't do that thinking about, hey, what are the other doors that are going to open up for me now that I have a normal college experience? But what ended up happening is when I started to get extra white space and I can kind of stop and smell the roses, I ended up dabbling in a lot of extracurricular things that typically athletes don't have time for. So things like studying abroad or working for an internship or just being social on campus. And I'd say that that was actually kind of the first pivotal moment where, because I quit swimming, I started working for a company we all know called Yahoo, one of the first big tech companies in Silicon Valley. And that got my foot in the door for the tech industry. And so naturally, when I graduated college in 2008, and especially during that time with the boom of all these startups, it was very natural to just transition my career into tech, right? So, I started working for tech companies, large and small, and I found maybe 4 or 5 years into my tech career that I really enjoyed the startup environment. I just love to build. I love being scrappy, being part of a small team where you can have high impact. And when you work for startups in Silicon Valley, you also work very closely with the CEOs and founders. And it was around, 4 or 5 years into my professional experience that I actually started to get my own itch to build my own startup. And when I think about startup, I'm thinking, oh, what tech company am I going to found? Because this is all I knew, you know? And so the path into food entrepreneurship was completely random. But that is kind of the impetus for like this initial drive of just wanting to start something. And, you know, a huge part of it was just being around others who've done it. But then I'd also say there was this big drive being a woman too, because growing up, you know, the women in my household being Asian American, it was not typical that the women were super career driven. A lot of them were kind of in the home, taking care of the family. And this was something that I felt like I wanted to challenge and feel like I could break the mold. So just there's a lot of like deep personal drive behind why I'm an entrepreneur today. And whether it's Great Nola or whether it was some other product, it doesn't even really matter. I think a lot of it is just trying to prove it to myself that I can pursue something that I'm passionate about, create value for myself and create value for others at the same time.
I really connect with that so much, Erica, and really love how you kind of tie it back to just something that's really deep inside of you. I think that's really something that runs true with many other entrepreneurs and is probably a through line that we're going to be seeing here as we have conversations with other female founders as well. So that's really interesting.
Obviously, this is a very sweet in more ways than one story. I am sure it wasn't all, you know, just like throwing a tray of granola into the oven. So tell us a little bit about somewhere between, hey, babe, you should really take this idea and run with it, and actually like getting this stuff on the shelves. There was a story in the middle there. Tell us a little bit about how some of the perseverance and the grit that undoubtedly you cultivated at being a swimmer throughout high school and obviously almost semi-professionally, I think it would be fair to call it, in college, how that played a role in taking what seemed like a great idea at the outset, simple, let's just do this thing, into fruition. Yeah. I'm sure it wasn't all easy.
Yeah.
You know, I have to say getting started wasn't really the hard part. I am super, hey, I'm going to try to do something. Let's take a small step and like, let's just be very action oriented versus, you know, I think a lot of people who might be thinking about founding businesses start so big with their vision and the strategic planning. I'm much more of a, hey, let me just like throw spaghetti at the wall and see if it sticks. And so the start wasn't too hard, which was I pretty much decided, let me just test this product, see if people are going to like it, pay for it, repeatedly buy it, not my friends and family, to see if I have a good product, right? So in the tech world, that first step is almost like finding product market fit. You just want to get rapid feedback. And so I launched at the farmer's market. I was a cottage food operator, meaning I was baking the granola out of my home kitchen. I still kept my full-time job. This was literally just a little test, a little side project. And I would say that it took about 3 months for me to kind of figure out, okay, what's my brand name? What's my packaging? What's my formula? How do I get into a farmer's market? Yada, yada, yada. It's very inundating, of course, when you're starting, but that's actually not the hard part. The hard part is, okay, once you're like, okay, I think I have a good product. I think people like it. I think I could sell this in other channels. The hard part is actually starting to get traction and building a channel, right? Where it's repetitive, it's scalable. You know, it's not just like one niche farmer's market where you're like, you know, hustling granola in person. Like that's just not scalable.
I'm just curious what happens when you like hit a wall or run into some sort of roadblock. Like, what are the things that you say to yourself? What are the conversations that you have with Tank? What are the things you do to get yourself like remotivated to keep going? Is it hard for you? Is it something that comes naturally? I'm really curious about this.
So I would say in the beginning when, okay, I kind of knew I had a really good product. I'm already in the farmer's market, but what's next? Mm-hmm. That part, you know, it definitely is a wall. But then I think what really helped me was just also kind of having the safety net of my full-time job. So I didn't leap in right away after I felt like, oh, the farmer's market was successful. Or even, you know, pretty quickly after that, I was able to get Google as one of my first corporate clients, which is huge. But even then, I didn't feel like I truly had this momentum of repetitively getting new wins. And so You know, in the beginning, I really didn't take myself too seriously. I think if you put a ton of pressure on yourself where you're just like, I think it could work both ways. I think some founders like want to be in a do or die situation. But for me, I think it really served me in the beginning to be a little bit more less pressure, keep the full-time job, have the stability, and let it kind of come to fruition on my own time with no rush, right? So for me, that really, really helped.
Yeah. Well, but at some point you did have to take that leap and you did have to cut the umbilical cord, so to speak, from the secure corporate job. What was that day like? When did the light bulb go off? I think this is something I'm really going to do full time.
Sure. So that journey took 4.5 years from when I started.
Whoa.
So that's where it's like, it was a very slow process for me. I'd say it's very atypical for a lot of founders. You know, there were key moments in that time period where I was equally straddling a career in tech that I was at one point pretty passionate about. And then as I was able to get more momentum in Great NOLA, and I was able to see, hey, you know, the more that I prospect, the more that I get connected, the more that I sample, the more I do this, I actually see myself impacting the bottom line of the business. That's when I slowly started to feel like one well, like my corporate well was starting to drain and my Great NOLA well was starting to fill. And it got to the point where you realize you're spending all your energy, all your time, all your mind share at a job that has an empty well. And this other well that's incredibly fulfilling to you is completely full, but none of your physical time is being spent there. That's when it was very clear I had to make the leap. Just to let you know, me making the decision to take the leap, it wasn't like one day I woke up and I'm like, oh, this well's empty, this well's full, I'm quitting my job. No, I gave myself a year. Like I literally gave myself a year. The way I kind of trick myself is I'm one of those people who, if I tell someone something publicly, I'm usually going to follow through. So I started telling my husband, I started telling my friends, I even told the CEO at my company who's very open to entrepreneurship. And I said, hey, by this time next year, I'm going to be doing this full time. And I basically made sure that they held me accountable. And then I ended up making the leap like in 10 months versus 12 months, which is,
that's so great.
Yeah. So it was a process.
Okay, so first of all, I have a couple of thoughts, but I feel like your superpower is your patience. Like that's incredible that you were able to take that time and make this leap, but it wasn't a leap. It was a series of slow steps that allowed you to put yourself in a position to be successful. I think that sometimes people do make the leap and then they fall. And sometimes it's much more beneficial to take things slow and steady. So that's really interesting.
I actually think that something that you touched on is this concept of we're with Making It Happen, we're really striving to give people tools in their toolkit. And one thing, and of course this isn't for everyone, but it sounds like it was effective for you, resonates with Katie and I, speaking it into existence, or as you've just described, using your admission of a desire, your goal to go and do this full time, and sharing that with the people closest to you, starting, of course, with your husband, maybe immediate family and close friends, speaking it into existence and letting those words in turn hold you accountable to seeing that through. I personally find whenever I'm like wanting to accomplish something and I keep it to myself, it's usually a clear indication of my lack of confidence in myself, my insecurity. The minute you do share it with someone, this is something I want to do, the words are out there living in the world, and turning them into reality is your next job.
You have a background as a swimmer, which is a self-motivating sport. Do you think that has helped you in those times where you're lacking motivation and you're not exactly sure what to do? Or how do you get through those times?
Sure. So I definitely think the lessons that I learned from swimming directly translates into what I do, whether it's my business or whether it was my full-time career. I'm not afraid to work hard. I work well under structure. I'm super competitive. And it's like eyes on the line on the ground, and you just kind of keep going, and you're just not always going to win, right? And a business is very similar. I would say it's one thing to endure physical pain, but I think it's another thing to endure as a founder, this constant self-doubt and fear of failure in some ways. And, on the other side, even when I was swimming, although it's an individual sport, you have a coach and you still have a team and you have to show up or you're going to be in trouble, right? With a business, there's no one holding me accountable but myself. Again, as a solo founder, it's even tougher because I don't have another co-founder or I don't even have full-time staff. I have contractors, remote contractors. So everything is on me. And one of the first things that I had to figure out when I went full-time was creating structure in my week, in my day, because there's no one there outlining a practice for me or a framework for me. So that was really key in kind of getting into a rhythm early on. And then, I do think that there's a huge, especially as you grow a business, you're going to naturally do this. But in the beginning, like, even when you're figuring things out, you still have to kind of go through a formal, like, goal setting and kind of putting like numbers on paper. I didn't have like a really fancy bottoms up business plan or a model when I started. But you still need to have something to guide you as your North Star. And I think that's really important to do when you're first starting out, even if you don't know what you're doing.
Tell us about a moment, and you just touched on this, but imposter syndrome, having a moment of doubt, especially when you're a one-woman show, it sounds like. Contractors obviously provide support in key areas for you. But what about when you need a shoulder to lean on? Like, I can tell you for sure, having Katie here as my rock and my sounding board is something I'm so grateful for. Perhaps you have those in other aspects of your life, but not immediately in your business. So when it's a business matter, who do you lean on? What are those moments of aloneness and self-doubt like? How do you work through them?
Yeah, I would say a lot of times when I'm super focused on, let's say, like a new product launch, there's really no space to have like self-doubt and fear of failure because you're so busy. There's just no space. There's no capacity, right? But your business is not always going to be centered around like some huge campaign, some product launch unless you're launching things all the time. And so I would say that this feeling of imposter syndrome and lack of confidence it's a common thread that happens frequently, and not every single day. But again, it like comes into those little crevices when you might have a little bit of downtime and you're just like, oh my God, am I doing things right? Am I making the right decisions? I think what's really, really important for me, and I've learned to prioritize this even when I am incredibly busy, is networking. So being in the natural food and beverage space, luckily it's a very friendly and communal one. And, I'm not afraid to go on LinkedIn and, there might be a brand that I know of or a founder that I've heard of and just reach out with no agenda, very authentic. Hey, I love your brand. I'd love to connect with you as founders and just like share my story and hear about yours and see how we can support each other. And so I'd say I've proactively networked through these years where I have a large network, but then I definitely have like an immediate tier of people, founders like me, who are kind of like my go-tos when it's just like, hey, I want to talk, right? And they do the same thing with me. And so I think that's so important to just make sure that you have a support network. And a lot of these people I didn't know prior to being in the industry or the business, and now they're great friends. And I do think it provides a healthy balance with, also the support that I have from my husband, because even though my husband has been very supportive and I could talk to him about anything, you also don't want to inundate your relationship with just your business too. So I think it's important to like find support both in your industry, but also out of your industry as well.
Can you tell us about a specific moment in the last few years where that sense of doubt or insecurity crept in, like a business problem you faced and how you grappled with it? What do you do? Do you go on a big hike? Do you go kite surfing? Tell us a little bit about the tools in your toolkit to identify that creeping in, which I'm loving this phrase, and then how you tackle it.
Gosh, last year, 2020 was really, really hard. So COVID, it lifted a lot of food brands, especially ones in grocery stores where there was a lot of pantry loading and online shopping. And while I do have an online presence, the majority of my business is actually supplying tech offices like Google. And we all know that with COVID, they all went remote, and they've been remote pretty much even to this day. I think some offices are starting to return. So It's really interesting because I think there's like kind of like three phases sometimes that I feel like I can be in. Number one could be you're so busy, you're in such execution mode, you have this launch, you're so busy, you don't have time or space to think about imposter syndrome, fear of failure. You're just focused on the next step and like getting the ball rolling. Then sometimes there could be lulls, which are like, okay, what's next? I just launched this. Like, what's the next thing that's going to take me to the next level? And I would say that's where sometimes that fear creeps in. But then there's times of crisis, right? Which was, to me, last year was crisis mode, where suddenly all these offices shut down and I had to like figure out how to not only keep my business afloat, but suddenly I had to figure out how to replace $50,000 worth of granola somewhere else because the Googles of the world they're not going to take it. So, I want to say that the first thing is like recognizing that in life and in business, there are these phases and there's no way of getting around it. There's no world where I would be like, oh, I hope that I never have these lulls or these feelings of imposter syndrome. I think the first thing is recognizing like this is natural and this is going to happen. And when it does happen, be aware, but then also keep it moving because everything is cyclical, right? So as long as you make sure you don't let that undermine what you're doing, then you can take it in stride and also have confidence to know that it too shall pass, right? And there's definitely tactics that you can employ, like, okay, go talk to it. I like to go talk to other people. Like a lot of times when I talk to other founders, it just motivates me. It gives me more ideas. I'm more extroverted. So it's nice to like touch base with other people. Other people like my husband, he's introverted. He's the type that if he were in a similar situation, he'd probably go on long walks by himself. So I think it can vary depending on like where you draw your energy from, what's therapeutic to you. But I will say that no matter what, whether in crisis mode, execution mode, or imposter syndrome lull mode, I always make sure that I sleep well. Like that's just something that I've never sacrificed. I always consistently work out. And in the most times of, I would say like challenging times, I really try to make sure that I eat healthy because what I don't want to do is undermine myself in other aspects of life. And then suddenly I feel like I am just like rock bottom.
Well, I have to say that phrase, this too shall pass, has gotten me through some of the hardest times in business. Because it's a mantra to get yourself through something. That's when I'm in crisis, I have to do a lot of self-talk to get myself through that hard moment.
100%.
And I feel like you just gave us some really, really important tips and tools for our kit. Really making sure that people who are in business understand the cycles and the phases, and being able to recognize and tell yourself like, this is a phase. This too shall pass is something that's so huge.
Yeah. And the second part of that is the concept of that forward motion. Like this too shall pass because you recognize it, but then you put one foot in front of the other. Don't hover or dwell on it or feel bogged down by it, because the worst thing to progress is stagnation. So just taking that first step, whether it's to a conversation like you've suggested, to the kitchen for a healthy snack, to feed your body, your mind, like that's also important. Do you view grit as absolutely essential to any founder? And by that, I don't mean that you have to come saddle, with it full force at the outset. It is something that you can grow and develop. How important do you think grit has been in your story? And how do you define it? How would you describe that word and what it really means in the context of entrepreneurship?
I would say that there's a balance between grit and showing up prepared, putting in the hard work, as well as luck and opportunity. If you don't put in the hard work, if an opportunity arises, you're probably going to miss, right? So for me, grit is 100% essential. I absolutely believe it. To me, it means being able to stick things through no matter how good or bad the going gets. And I think patience is a really big part of it too, but it can't just be passive patience. It has to be active patience, right? Where you're actually doing things. You can't just wait for things to come. I think grit is the biggest part of the battle. But at the same time, things aren't going to work if you don't have the right product or if you don't have the right unit economics, no matter how gritty you are. Maybe you might be gritty enough to pivot and like do something else, but you do have to make sure that you have the fundamentals. Or, for example, when we talk about opportunity, if you're doing a business that is just an industry that's on a decline, no matter how gritty you are, it may not work, right? So I do think that it does need to align with opportunity, trends, and also doing something that like the market wants. So, but grit is huge. I'm a big kind of growth versus fixed mindset person. So I think it's the key in anything that you're doing if you're going to be successful in it or not.
100%. One concept that you're also familiar with, and I think that goes really hand in hand with grit, is knowing when to quit. And I think you've talked in some writings I've read, some blogging and posts that you've made about how tough it was for you. I mean, of course, you were young in college to think about quitting swimming, but obviously doing so led to another chapter in your life, which led to where you are now. I think that knowing when to quit or knowing when to stop going down one path and pivot to another can often be colored in a really negative light. And there's a lot of shame around that. But in reflecting back on it where you sit now, I'm sure you would argue the complete opposite, that was one of the best, most self-assured decisions you probably made, and look where it's led you now. To anyone out there who is feeling like they might need to stop one path and pivot to another and is terrified, or anyone out there who had to recognize this isn't working, let me try something new. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs to be, have some experience in this vein. Could you share a little bit about your experience with quitting and what ultimately that has meant to you?
So I will say that when I quit swimming, I was 19, I didn't have that foresight and I didn't have that wisdom to be like, well, this is going to lead to better things. It was really a decision of values and purpose, and like, I can't live and continue this way if I'm like so unhappy and so unfulfilled. Luckily, my parents were supportive of the decision. I imagine it can be really hard if you're young and you have parents that, really didn't condone the decision. But luckily, I had that freedom from a young age. I think the reflection and realizing how quitting can be sometimes one of your best decisions didn't happen until I actually started thinking about quitting my job to pursue Great NOLA. And I was able to tie that back to when I quit swimming. So the wisdom and like the retrospective kind of like awareness of, oh, wow, the value in quitting. See, when I quit swimming when I was 19, look at all these things that happened. It also just didn't happen to me. It also came from the fact that I'm action oriented. I go out and seek opportunities. I take initiative, right? So I think one thing you can't expect is that, oh, I'm going to quit and then all these other things are going to come to me. No, you got to put yourself out there. That's the first thing. But I kind of already knew that I'm already like that from like a personality perspective. So then when I was thinking about quitting my tech career, it was very scary, but then I was able to lean back on that previous experience and have some data to give me confidence that, hey, this is creating space. This is actually creating space for something that I am actively pursuing. When I quit swimming, I didn't know what I was going to do after that. But I do think an exercise that also really helped me was just thinking about what's the worst that can happen, right? So if you quit your job or if you quit your business or if you decide to quit this product and pivot, what's the opportunity cost on both sides? Worst case, what if the new endeavor fails? Are you going to be out on the street? Are you not going to be able to feed your kids? Like everyone has different kind of, things that they have to weigh out. And for me, it wasn't too difficult of a decision because it was like, well, if I fail, I just go back to a tech job and hey, I have this awesome thing on my resume to talk about. And if anything, it would help elevate my career, but it's always there for me. So that helped put things in perspective as well. It's just kind of doing that worst case scenario. But what you don't want is to also live in regret that, when you had this opportunity, if you didn't take advantage of it, you don't want to be 70 years old thinking back like, gosh, like what if I really did try that out?
I'm curious if working in Silicon Valley, being in what was obviously a big boys club back then, and then having that journey overlap, like that sort of phase of your career end while you were launching your own business in the food space, was there any tension? Did you have to call on any real grit and perseverance and drive to prove to anyone that your decision to move into a food startup was justified? Did anyone doubt your choice? Did you have to convince anyone?
Luckily, the company that I worked for last was almost 50% women. The market that we served were a lot of female solo entrepreneurs, people in like the wedding and event planning space. So luckily, I came from a tech culture that was very inclusive, very communal, and I had a lot of female coworkers. In fact, 2 of the 4 co-founders were females. So they were very supportive from the get-go. And I know this is not the same for everyone. At the same time, coming from the broad lens of tech and all the companies that I work for, of course, it's most predominantly male. But then really when I was thinking about when I quit, you only think about the peers that you had at that last job that you decided to quit. And luckily that was super smooth sailing and it was a lot of support. I will say that it has been very refreshing though to be in this natural food space, because while there are, I would say a lot of the conglomerates and, probably executives at these corporate companies are males, there's a lot of female founders. And now more than ever, the industry is really, really embracing diversity, whether it's your, AAPI, Black owned, LGBTQ, or, female owned. So there's a huge amount of support here that I do feel like does kind of contrast to the typical tech industry. And I'm just learning to like embrace that, right? So there's things that you don't want to take for granted and things that you should actively appreciate. And that's something that I remind myself that I'm so lucky to work in an industry that I'm in today.
Erica, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really inspiring, and I feel like I'm coming away with a few new things to think about as we navigate running our business. So
A few tools for our own kits.
Yes.
Appreciate it very much.
Thanks for making it happen and having me.
I like that. You did it.
She did it. We didn't even tell you to do that. So as we were just talking, something that I saw like both of us really light up to was when Erica was describing her experience having moments of doubt, imposter syndrome, or feeling just like ill-equipped to handle something and having that needing to tackle that emotion because it comes at you out of nowhere.
Yeah.
What do you think about how that happens to you and me? And what do you think about it as a kind of a telltale sign that you might need to take a moment and just live in that discomfort a little bit? But then also, what's the antidote to it? Is it moving forward instantly, or how do you think about that?
So I very much connected with her when she was saying imposter syndrome shows up after you've just completed a big project.
Yes.
That to me was okay, yes, I am there. I know exactly what that moment is, because it's you're at the top of the mountain. You feel like you've accomplished this big thing, but there's actually so much more to go. And you're okay, what next? Where do I go next?
Yeah.
It's that. It's a hard feeling, and you start doubting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought was really helpful was her to think about it as cycles. And for you, when she thinks about it as cycles and knows, okay, this is an actual phase. This is something that I will get through. And to actually stop and be like, why am I feeling this way is something that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something that I think a lot about, because one of the things I struggle with the most is kind of putting challenges or insecurities or worries or fears on the sidelines and plowing forth. And it's really easy to do that, as you've just described, when you're heading towards a big deadline or you're approaching a big product launch. But what then happens is that your system gets flooded with it at the very end, and it's incredibly demoralizing and it's incredibly jarring. So thinking about cycles is, just as you've described, is the healthiest way to do it. You think about things as small hills to climb. You go up a mountain, you go down the other side. You go up another mountain, go down the other side, as opposed to just some epic climb at the top of which you're realizing you're there without a rope and a safety net, and all of those other emotions have the opportunity to sink in.
Exactly. I think the other thing that was really interesting, and which is like a real tool in your toolbox, is some of their daily routines that she was mentioning, like the healthy eating or the exercising or whatever it is for whoever you are. No matter what phase you're in, if you're able to keep some of that stuff consistent, I think it helps you through the harder phases.
100%. Or using those little outlets, little venting moments. Like, I know that I always feel better when I share something with you that I'm stressed out about. If I wait till the end of the week, the month, the quarter to be like, oh, Katie, this is giving me a lot of anxiety and stress, I'm way worse served. I would be far better off if I just touched base with you on that weekly. And whether that's touching base with your business partner or your spouse, or going on a walk if maybe you're more introverted, like Erica's husband is, or in Erica's case, she reaches out to a friend, a fellow entrepreneur that she networks with regularly. I think these tools are really important.
It's so important. Saying it out loud is the thing. It makes the difference in the world.
That was another great theme of today's conversation. Say it out loud. Express yourself.
Yes.
Let your fears out too, because you can sooner contend with your fears. They're out in the open than if you're keeping them inside.
That's right.